In this video, I want to tell you a little bit about intermittent occupancy and the VA home loan. I'm going to define what intermittent occupancy is and let you figure out if you have an intermittent occupancy situation. And more importantly, I'm going to tell you exactly how you can get approved in an intermittent occupancy scenario. So stay tuned to the very end of this video because there are a lot of things to unpack on this topic. So first of all, let's talk about this. What is intermittent occupancy? Let's say that three times fast, right? Intermittent occupancy is where someone lives a long distance from where they work. So typically, if it's over an hour commute time, and you have a situation where you have to get a second residence, and you're going back and forth between properties, that's what's called intermittent occupancy. And first of all, I want to say it is definitely different than a travel job. You have travel jobs where you stay at one location and then they send you off around the country to work, maybe a sales job, something like that. That's different than intermittent occupancy. This is where you have a residence that's different from where you work, and there are lots of reasons for this. So, for example, my dad did this. Years and years ago, my dad was a consultant with a very, very specialized computer program. And they maintained his residence with my mother here in the Dayton, Ohio area. But the program was so specialized that he would go to different cities. So he was in Columbus for about 2 years. He was in St. Louis for a year or two. He was in DC for a couple of years. And he would commute back and forth. That's intermittent occupancy. So he would be in the city where the job was for 4 days a week. And then he'd fly home to Ohio, see my mom, and then go back out. And he did that for years. And then so that's considered intermittent occupancy. And the reason he did that is because he didn't want to uproot my mom, sell the house, go into some other town for 2 years, and resell the house, move back. That's a lot of hassle, right? And he wanted to maintain the residence in Ohio. And sure enough, when he retired, he came back to Ohio. Everything's good. So that is intermittent occupancy. That's the definition of intermittent occupancy. Now, the VA has very specific guidelines on intermittent occupancy, and there are some differences on whether it's an active duty situation or a civilian job, because they do want to prevent loan fraud. There are certain people that will try to do this to game the system, and they definitely don't want that. And so I'm going to go through this step by step and explain exactly how this works. So the first time's active duty intermittent occupancy. That's pretty simple, where someone is stationed in a city, their spouse or dependent child is in another area, and they don't want to move to the duty station city because they know they're only going to be there a couple of years, and then the child has to move, change schools, all that, right? It's a lot of stress, a lot of hassle. So they'd be like, you know what? We know we're going to retire in Ohio, and so we're going to stay in Ohio. We're going to keep our kid in that same school, but the military member is going to be going from station to station, doing their thing. And they know that they will come back to their main principal residence when the tour is over. A lot of times, especially, they're towards the end of their military career, and they know that they're going to go to a certain area that maybe they've lived in a long time, that the spouse or dependent child can satisfy occupancy. The VA guidelines are very specific on this and super easy to do. No problems there. It gets a little bit more complicated when we talk about civilian intermittent occupancy. And so that's where a civilian has a job where they are not in the same area. Again, I mentioned my dad that he was doing consulting. I recently had another situation, actually, which inspired this video, where someone is trying to buy a home in South Carolina, but their job's in Florida. And the reason being is they do a very, very specialized job. But the wife said, you know what, my family's in South Carolina and we want to be in South Carolina, and he wants to retire in South Carolina. And so they have a lot of reasons to be in South Carolina. And so they want to create a residence in South Carolina. And also he wants to have that job in Florida. And it is a job that's stationed in Florida. It's not a travel job. And so he's going to commute back and forth. And so that's one of many examples of intermittent occupancy. But I will tell you, it's a gray area. As I worked with this veteran to make this deal happen, I've talked to a lot of different lenders, a lot of different interpretations. Some lenders are so scared of getting buybacks and certain things happening with the VA that they don't even want to touch it because it's an area where there are a lot of landmines and underwriting, a lot of lender overlays, and a lot of them just don't want to mess with it. And so in this particular case, having a VA expert, someone that knows VA guidelines very, very well, is critically important. This is not the kind of scenario you want to be testing the new loan officer on, because it, there's just a lot of things to unpack on these scenarios. Um, I would also say working at mortgage broker is important because there are so many different lenders or so many different underwriters, so many different interpretations, that you want to have options. As a mortgage broker, I have 150 different companies I work with. And it's nice because actually what I did on this particular scenario is I asked multiple companies what they thought about it, and I was able to find one that will do it. The other thing to consider is, we can and should get a letter from the VA Regional Loan Center, get an opinion letter, basically the loan officer, or you can do it too, but typically the loan officer would write to the VA and say, hey, here's our scenario. Are you able to do it? And the more detail you can provide us on your scenario, the better. And so I also want to say that you also need to have a good reason for the intermittent occupancy. And also you do need to have significant ties to the local area. Ideally, if you live in the area where you are establishing permanent residency, then that's certainly helpful. It's not always required, but you need to have significant ties. And now I want to go through a little bit of the official guidance from the VA, so we can talk about this as well. As I flip it over that screen, cool. So here's what the VA says about this. The veteran needs not maintain a physical presence of the property daily. However, occupancy as the veteran's home implies the veteran is located within reasonable proximity from the veteran's place of employment. If the veteran's employment requires the veteran's absence for a substantial amount of time, the following two conditions must be met. These are very important here. First, the veteran must have a history of continuous residence in the community, and the veteran must have no indication that they have established, intend to establish, or may be required to establish a principal residence elsewhere. So there you go. So that's the big thing, is they need to have a history of residency in that community. Now there is a little bit of back and forth. Like, it doesn't necessarily mean you have to be a resident right before you go there. So for example, in this particular case, they had maintained residency in South Carolina for several years. Their parents lived there, but they went to Ohio for a couple years and sold their residence in Ohio, which that's where I met them. And now they're going back to South Carolina. And so that would be okay because they had ties to that community. Where the VA doesn't want it to happen is where you're like, well, I think Denver's kind of cool right now. I like skiing. I have no reason to move there other than the fact we like to ski. So we're just going to move out there, and I'm going to maintain a job in Cincinnati. But you have like no real reason to go there. They don't like that. And you would not be able to do it in that kind of scenario. So that's a little bit about intermittent occupancy. Like I said, it's a very complicated topic. Now I have a lot of other videos about VA guidelines, and I hope that you do watch the rest of my channel and check out some other videos. And as always, if you have any questions about VA loans, give me a call. My number is 937-572-3713 or scarpro.com. Talk to you later. Bye.